Male voice at my own Stanford MBA graduation dinner. My father looked at me in front of my boss, my professor, and everyone who believed in me and said, "We wish you'd never been born." So I stood up, paid for the meal, and granted his wish. My father said it slowly, deliberately, like he'd been saving it for the right room. "We wish you'd never been born." 6 words. Private dining room at Chez Laurent. White tablecloths, crystal glasses, candlelight. My Stanford MBA graduation dinner. My boss, Mr. Davidson, sat 3 feet to my right with his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. Professor Elaine Miller, who had written in my recommendation letter that I was the most disciplined student she'd taught in 22 years, went visibly pale. Michelle, my best friend since freshman year, stopped breathing. My colleague James put his wine glass down so carefully it didn't make a sound. My father said it the way you say something you've rehearsed, not in anger, in conclusion. And the room, the beautiful, expensive, candlelit room I had paid for, every single cent, down to the $340 wine my mother was currently halfway through, went absolutely silent. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this story. I want you to understand what it takes for a person to sit in a chair and absorb 6 words like those without flinching, without crying, without knocking the table over and walking out screaming. It takes a lifetime of practice. I grew up in Millfield, Ohio, in a house that was always just slightly too cold because my parents were always slightly too careful with the thermostat. My father, Gerald, was a civil engineer who worked for the county. My mother, Patricia, taught 2nd grade until she didn't. My brother, Alex, was born 3 years after me, and from the moment he arrived, the geometry of our household changed in ways I didn't have language for until I was much older. I was the oldest. I was supposed to be the responsible one. Fine, I understood that. What I didn't understand, couldn't understand, when I was 9 or 12 or 15, was why being responsible meant being invisible. When Alex got a B+ on a geometry test sophomore year, my parents drove 40 minutes to Best Buy and came home with a new laptop to help him study. I remember standing in the kitchen doorway watching them set it up, doing the math in my head. That laptop cost $800. I had been asking for new winter boots since October. It was February. I was wearing 2 pairs of socks inside shoes with a crack along the left sole. I didn't say anything. I went to the garage, found my father's duct tape, and fixed the shoe myself. At 14, during a January cold snap that dropped to 11 degrees, I climbed onto our roof and fixed a leak while my parents were at Alex's basketball tournament 3 hours away. I found the problem. A section of flashing had separated, watched 3 YouTube videos on my phone, went to the hardware store with the $40 from my sock drawer, and fixed it. When they came home, my mother said, "Oh, good, we were worried about that." She did not ask how I'd gotten up there. She did not ask if I'd been cold. Alex's team had lost. That was the main topic at dinner. None of this is meant to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you the architecture of the place I came from so you understand the kind of person it built and didn't build me into. I worked. That was what I did. I worked the way some people drink, constantly, compulsively, because the alternative was too uncomfortable to consider. I graduated high school with a 4.0 and a partial scholarship to Ohio State, worked 2 jobs to cover the gap, graduated with honors in economics, got into Stanford's MBA program, and spent the next 2 years doing the hardest intellectual work of my life, while also, somehow, managing to wire money home every time my parents called with an emergency. And they called often. The first time was during my first week of MBA coursework. My mother's voice on the phone, low and urgent. "Your father had a scare with his heart. Nothing serious, but the deductible." I sent $200 before the call was over. The second time, 3 months later, Alex needed tutoring, a specialized tutor. And could I help? $600. Then it was the car repair, then the unexpected property tax, then, most significantly, the reason I wore the same 2 sweatshirts for an entire Chicago winter during my study abroad semester, the call that Alex's college tuition had a gap that the financial aid office had created through an administrative error. And could I please, Chris, just wire over what I had? I wired $8,400. I had been saving it for London, for 1 semester of actually living in a city I'd dreamed about since a geography class in 7th grade showed me a photo of the Thames at dusk. Instead, I wore 2 sweatshirts and told my roommate I wasn't hungry when he asked if I wanted to grab dinner, and I worked. I told myself it was fine. I told myself this was what families did. I told myself that one day, maybe not now, maybe not soon, but one day they would see it. They would see me, and I would be standing somewhere I'd earned, and they would look at me the way Professor Miller looked at me across her office desk when she told me about the scholarship committee's decision, with something that looked like wonder, and they would know. I held on to that. I held on to it for years. The graduation dinner was my idea. I booked Chez Laurent 6 weeks in advance, $340 deposit, non-refundable, 8 seats. I invited my parents, Alex, Michelle, my colleague James Whitfield, Professor Miller, and my boss, Richard Davidson. Mr. Davidson, for context, 54 years old, Stanford MBA himself, class of 1994, founder and CEO of Davidson Capital Group, where I'd been working for 14 months in corporate strategy. He had taken a chance on me out of a recruiting pool of 300 applicants. He was not a warm man exactly, but he was a fair one, and he had said to me once, quietly, after I'd stayed until midnight on the Peterson account and turned a near disaster into a net positive, "You're going to be something, Kowalski. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I had not forgotten that. My parents arrived an hour late. No card, no gift, not even a flower from the gas station on the corner. My mother walked in first, wearing her church blazer, and announced before she'd even reached the table, "Alex sends his love. He's on an emergency shift. The hospital needed him. You know how it is with doctors." She beamed. She was still beaming when she sat down and accepted the glass of burgundy I'd ordered. I noted their lateness. I noted the absence of a card. I filed both things in the part of my brain where I kept things I wasn't ready to feel yet, and I smiled, and I introduced my parents to my boss and my professor and my closest friend. The meal was beautiful. The food was extraordinary. Professor Miller told a story about my coursework that made the table laugh. James raised his glass and said something gracious about what I'd contributed to our team. Mr. Davidson listened with the careful attention he brought to everything. Not effusive, just present, the way important men sometimes are. I was happy. For approximately 45 minutes, I was genuinely, unguardedly happy. Then my mother mentioned Alex again, his residency, his hours, the lives he was saving. My father nodded along with the particular pride of a man who has accomplished something by proxy. Professor Miller, sensing the current in the room, turned to my parents and said warmly, "You must be so proud of Christopher. Honestly, in 22 years of teaching, he is one of perhaps 4 or 5 students I'd call genuinely exceptional." A beat of silence. My mother took a slow sip of wine. "Of course we love both our sons," she said, "but Alex is the one actually saving lives." There it was. That was the needle. Slipped in so smoothly you could almost miss it. Almost tell yourself you'd misheard, that she'd meant something else, that it was just a mother's pride in a different child. I saw Michelle's jaw tighten. I saw Mr. Davidson set down his glass. Then my father stood up. He was a big man once. He'd gotten smaller with age, the way some fathers do. The authority had compressed. The bigness had settled lower, but he still had the voice. He still had the deliberate cadence of a man who believed he was the most important person in any given room. "An MBA is fine for making money," he said, waving his hand the way you'd shoo a fly. "But you can't compare it to being a doctor. Different league entirely." And then, in the silence that followed, in the candlelit, white table-clothed 340 deposit silence of the room I had worked 12 years to earn the right to sit in. "We wish you'd never been born." Slowly, deliberately, like a verdict. I will tell you what happened in my body when he said it, because I think the body is more honest than the mind in moments like that. My hands went completely still. Not rigid, still. The way things go still before they break, or before they decide not to. My vision narrowed slightly. The ambient sound of the restaurant seemed to recede, like someone had turned a dial. I was aware of every face at the table in my peripheral vision. Michelle's horror, Mr. Davidson's jaw setting hard, Professor Miller's color gone entirely, and I was also, somehow, very calm. Not numb. Calm. There is a difference, because something had snapped inside me. Not violently, cleanly, the way a thread finally gives after years of incremental load, and you barely hear it go. Something that had been holding a certain door open, the door that faced toward them, toward their approval, toward the someday when they would see me. That door had just closed, quietly. Finally, I stood up. The room watched. I looked my father dead in the eye. I want to be precise about this. I did not look away from him. I did not look at my mother. I did not look for support from anyone at that table. I looked at Gerald Kowalski directly, with the entirety of what I had become, and I said, "Wish granted. Live your lives as though your son Christopher never existed." I reached into my jacket, placed my credit card on the table without breaking eye contact, for the meal. Then I walked out of Chez Laurent, through the heavy front door and into the cold San Francisco night, and I did not look back. What happened after that was less cinematic and more procedural, which is how real change usually works. I blocked every number. My parents, the 2 cousins who would inevitably be used as intermediaries, the landline I'd been calling since I was a teenager. I moved apartments 3 weeks later, a new place in Hayes Valley that cost $400 more per month and was worth every dollar because it had no history. I threw myself into work with the kind of focus that comes from having nothing else to protect. The Peterson account, which had been a slow-burning crisis for 2 months, became my obsession. I worked 16-hour days. I flew to Dallas twice. I restructured a deal that 3 senior analysts had given up on, and I presented the result to Mr. Davidson on a Tuesday morning in a conference room that smelled like good coffee and possibility. He looked at the numbers for a long time. Then he looked at me. "I remember your graduation dinner," he said. I said nothing. "You paid for that meal." He said it not as a question. I did. He nodded once, slowly, and approved the Peterson restructure, and we did not speak of my parents again. For 3 months, I lived inside work and quiet. No family, no drama, just the clean, bright, controllable world of numbers and strategy, where the rules were knowable and the outcomes were proportional to effort. It was, honestly, the most peaceful I'd been in years. Then Michelle called and asked me to dinner. She chose a small Thai place in the Mission, the kind with mismatched chairs and a laminated menu and food that embarrasses the expensive restaurant. We'd been going there since grad school. She ordered the green curry and pushed it around her plate for 10 minutes before she said, "There's something I've kept from you for years, and I need you to know. I watched her. You know I briefly dated Alex, sophomore year. I had known this. It had lasted about 6 weeks, Alex visiting from Ohio State twice, and then it had ended with no particular drama, and we'd never really discussed it. One night, Michelle said carefully, he took me to this part of Oakland I didn't know. Industrial area. He said he needed to make a quick stop. She paused. He told me to wait in the car, but the building had this window, grimy, facing the alley, and I could see inside. Another pause. Chris, it was an underground poker room. There were maybe 30 men in there. Cash everywhere. The kind of cash you don't bring to a game you're just playing for fun. She finally looked up at me. Alex was in the corner. He was losing badly. I could tell by how he was standing. He was screaming at the dealer. This look on his face like he'd been coming there for years. The green curry sat between us, untouched. I didn't say anything at the time because you two were, I thought it was a one-time thing. But then the calls started. The money you were sending home. And I'd think about that room and I'd think, she exhaled, Chris, that money you were wiring home for his college fund. I don't think it was going to school. The silence in that Thai restaurant was a different quality from the silence at Chez Laurent. That silence had been theatrical, witnesses present, a scene playing out. This silence was internal, structural. The pieces didn't fall into place gradually. They arrived all at once, like a photograph developing in a single second. Every urgent call, every manufactured crisis, the heart scare that never appeared on any medical record I'd ever been shown, the tuition gap created by an administrative error, the London money, the boots with the cracked sole, the 2 sweatshirts, the double shifts, every dollar I had sent home in 12 years, not emergencies, not tuition, a gambling addiction, covered and managed and sustained for years with my money. And my parents had known. Every single time they called, they had known exactly where the money was going. They hadn't been managing a family crisis. They had been managing a supply chain. I sat with that for a long moment. My hands were not shaking. I was past the point where my hands shook at new information. How long have you known this? I asked. Years, she said. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I waited. Don't be, I said. I needed to be done with them before this made sense. 3 months after that dinner with Michelle, I was crossing my company's lobby at 8:47 a.m. on a Wednesday, medium Americano in my left hand, the Marston presentation in my bag, already mentally 3 steps into the morning. The automatic doors slid open. My parents were standing in the middle of the lobby. They looked smaller than I remembered. My father in his good coat, the one he wore to church and funerals. My mother in the blazer from the graduation dinner, as though they'd dressed for an occasion and weren't sure if they'd gotten the occasion right. The marble lobby of Davidson Capital Group was a specific kind of intimidating, 22 floors of glass and steel above it, a receptionist with the practiced neutrality of someone paid to deal with situations like this. I almost turned around. I stood there for 3 seconds, maybe 4, and I genuinely considered walking to the elevator bank and sending my assistant down to deliver a message. Then I thought, no, this is my world. I built this, and I am not going to make myself small in it because they walked through the door. I walked toward them. My father spoke first, gruff and transactional, the same register he used to discuss the leaking roof with the contractor when I was 14. Your brother's in a financial bind. Miscalculation with his student loans. He just needs a bridge to get through the end of his residency. You'd barely feel it at your salary. My mother's eyes had already filled. On cue. I had seen this exact production, the specific angle of her head, the way the tears arrived before the word, my entire life. You wouldn't want to stand in the way of everything this family invested in him, she said softly. Would you, Christopher? Everything this family invested in him. I became very aware of my breathing. In through the nose, out slow. The Americano was warm in my left hand. Across the lobby, my rival Mark Landon had appeared from nowhere, the way he always seemed to when something was happening. He was watching with the barely concealed enjoyment of someone who has been waiting for a crack to appear in your surface. I saw his smirk from 30 feet away. Good, I thought. No, I said. My father's face darkened. You have a moral obligation, a duty to your brother. After everything we sacrificed? My voice came out bigger than I'd intended. Carrying. The receptionist looked up. An analyst near the coffee station went still. I set my Americano down on the lobby table next to me, opened my briefcase. I had carried the document for 6 weeks, ever since the dinner with Michelle. Not because I planned this exact moment, but because I had learned in 12 years of being the backup plan for other people's disasters that documentation is the only language that can't be rewritten in the retelling. It was a single folded bank statement, 5 figures, wire transfer history, spanning 8 years, every transfer labeled in my own careful notation, for Alex's supplementary college fund, for Alex's tuition gap, for Alex's tutoring, for family emergency, medical. I held it up. I'm not talking about student loans, I said. I'm talking about a gambling addiction that your son has had since at least his sophomore year of college. I'm talking about an underground poker circuit in Oakland that a credible witness can place him in. I'm talking about 8 years of money I wired home, believing every single call, every single emergency that went directly to bookies. And you called me every time, knowing, every time. My mother's face went white, not the produced pallor of her lobby tears, real white. My father's mouth opened, closed. The elevator behind me chimed. timed. I heard the doors open and I heard footsteps, and I did not turn around because I did not need to. I knew the cadence of those footsteps, the measured, unhurried pace of a man who had built something significant and was not accustomed to rushing. Richard Davidson walked across the lobby and stood beside me without a word, looked at my parents, looked at me, took in the scene the way he took in all information, completely, without expression, processing at a speed you couldn't clock. Then he spoke calmly, at full carrying volume. It takes a real man to stand up to that kind of manipulation. We should all be so lucky to have someone like Christopher Kowalski in our corner. He said it loud enough for the entire lobby, the receptionist, the analyst by the coffee station, Mark Landon, whose smirk had vanished so completely it was as if it had never been there. My parents turned. They didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. They walked toward the glass doors, two small figures in their good coats, in a lobby built for people who had not spent their lives diminishing others, and the doors slid open, and they walked through them, and I watched them go, the people who had wished I'd never been born, walking out into the morning looking, finally, like they wished they hadn't come. Alex checked into a treatment facility in Scottsdale 7 weeks later. I don't know if it was voluntary or if something else precipitated it. I learned this from Michelle, who still tracked these things more carefully than I did. I wished him no harm. I wished him the specific, difficult, unglamorous work of getting better. Not for me, not for our parents, but for himself. Whatever version of himself was still underneath all of it. My parents did not call. I did not unblock them. The Peterson account closed at a 34% return above projections. Mr. Davidson promoted me to vice president of strategy in the spring. I have a corner office now with a view of the bay on clear days, which in San Francisco means about half the days, which is enough. Professor Miller sent me a note when she heard about the promotion, handwritten, 3 sentences. The last one said, "Some people are built by the love they receive. You were built by the love you refused to stop giving, even when it wasn't returned. That's rarer." I have it framed above my desk, not because I need the reminder anymore, but because it seems right to keep it somewhere visible, a record of the distance between where I started and where I stand. My father said 6 words in a candlelit room and thought they would define me. They did, just not the way he meant.